All right, so informed by my sketch, I went and got exposures. Now, the technique, I varied it a few different ways. I varied the lighting. I tried using flash, and it worked well. It definitely kept things in sharp focus where I wanted them to focus, and I was able to force the foreground out of focus, but it blasted them out. So then I used kind of the more available fill lighting and tried manual focus, but the problem with manual focus is sometimes the background got more in focus than my computer, and I want the computer and the background in focus. And that's because I wear glasses and I didn't have contacts in, you know. So I wasn't able to see it so well in the viewfinder. So sometimes auto focus is best. And so for these shots, and I think these have the most potential, from here to here. So I think this is kind of the winning shot. I'm going to take that to my desktop. The way I got this shot was to have macro mode, which just forces your camera to put your aperture at the most open it can be for the available light. And it was able to be more open, so a smaller f-stop, a more open aperture when I had the flash on, because the flash gives you lots of light. But it was blasting out my foreground too much and giving me harsh shadows. So this was a good compromise. And the larger that opening is for the aperture, the more selective depth you can have in your exposure. So I focused on the middle ground here. I focused on my keyboard in particular, and this area right here. And then I kind of focus locked by pressing the shutter release halfway down, and it was locked on here with automatic focus. And then I just kind of hunched down a little bit so that these foreground elements were really in the way, in between the frame. And you can practice that by shooting anything that's in a sequence. And I often do like books on a shelf, and I'll look down the books, and I'll practice focus locking on different book titles and letting the ones in front be out of focus and the ones behind be out of focus. So here I focused on this middle monitor and then kind of hunched down, and that got the foreground monitor out of focus. So that's just moving your focus lock around. And it's the same thing when you're shooting people and you want to focus on only a certain part of their face. You focus lock there, and then you reframe the shot. Okay, so I found kind of my first one, and it's my strongest exposure, showing the middle ground and background in focus, but the foreground out of focus, and still being a somewhat interesting exposure. I don't love the colors of these fluorescents, but color is easy to process out later. The next shot is showing my glasses and my desktop in focus and all this background stuff out of focus, so shooting from another angle. And for that, I started with manual focus. I was able to control that pretty well. You see everything here is in focus in the foreground, and then it slowly gradates out. And even though the glasses are only partly in focus right at the tip, they're still kind of a prominent character, which I need them to be. Let's see. I zoomed in then. So I want you to see the difference between these two shots, because the only difference between these two is how I zoomed. And it's dramatic. So this is zoomed all the way out, and look how much empty space there is in the background, right? And how much space there feels between this shelf and my desk. Feels like there's a whole lot of space in between. If I zoom in, it compresses all that space and really fills up the background with that space. But in the foreground, these didn't get that much bigger, but the background got a lot bigger. This is what's called the vertigo effect. And it's hard to see when it's not moving, but you can see it in your viewfinder really well. And it's called the vertigo effect. It has lots of names. Because Alfred Hitchcock first used it in his film Vertigo. Right. And sometimes it's called a push zoom shot. But here are some examples from film. And you might think it's a special effect, but it's not. It's just zooming in and pulling away at the same moment, because zoom compresses the space within the scene very dramatically. So I'm going to hit some of these highlights. And it's how you can make a space really charged. So as he goes up the stairs, you might not be able to see it too well on the projector, he gets stabbed, and then he falls down the stairs, and they didn't want to actually make this actor fall, so instead, it's very violent, so instead they just used the vertigo effect to make it look like the floor is coming closer to him.
Right.
And they do that just by zooming. This is from Jaws. Let me turn out the lights for you.
Right.
And so yes, there's a shark attack happening,
Right.
At sea, no big deal. But then when the person recognizes what's happening, it's a very violent, very violent film clip here. They do that. That's a very kind of famous Steven Spielberg early film vertigo effect.
It starts getting closer.
And that's just with the zoom lens.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me show you that again. So as a still photographer, what that means is, if it will let me do it, I can get this shot, and if I just zoom in, I can get this shot. And he gets a little bit bigger because he's close to the camera, but the background changes enormously with how you use zoom. So when you're trying to kind of give a charged space, so it's used a lot in horror movies. It's used to kind of make a moment more important. My favorite examples are in fantasy movies. This is where it was used in Vertigo. So Jimmy Stewart is climbing this clock tower. It's very fast. And he looks down, and to show that he's kind of affected by the height, it does that vertigo effect to warp the space. It's used in Lord of the Rings a lot to make a forest look like it's enchanted. So that's something fun to play with. But that's what I did here. Just like that Jaws clip, my camera was in the same position. This is zoomed all the way out. This is zoomed all the way in. So it makes the space a little bit more charged. Unfortunately, it's more focused on the remote control for the projector than on my glasses, but my glasses are still pretty prominent there, so that has some potential. I think this one probably has the most potential though. So this is very clearly focused on my glasses and my desktop, and then the background's quite out of focus. Do you guys agree?
Oh, yeah.
This is probably a good one to use. Right. And then I tried some portrait format ones too, and I liked this one quite a bit. It's always nice to have some different compositional choices. Now this is the same shot with a slightly different aperture, and it works okay. This is clearly out of focus, this is clearly in focus. It shows more of the desktop. The problem is it's so flat with all these horizontals. So I like these forced diagonals more. So you want to think of that. Your point of view, your angle, all of that. Okay, now the last shot, this is the love story part, right? And remember, I did these sketches before I got the shots, so I had to kind of set them up and be inspired. I wanted my glasses to be in the foreground but out of focus, so it feels like you're looking past them. I wanted these new, exotic, colorful glasses. Maybe introduce a little edge and a little excitement into this poor academic life. To be in the middle ground and be kind of the star, so they're clearly in focus.
Oh, yeah.
And then I want the background to be out of focus, because we already know what it is. It's the desktop. And we don't want it to take away from making these glasses really important. And it's on a grade book. And I decided to be bold and just make these vertical shots. So now I only have two. I think I like this one better because I like seeing the corner of the screen there. And it looks kind of like a race car. Even the back edge of those glasses is out of focus, but right there the focus is really sharp. And I do that all just by either manually focusing with a very small f-stop open aperture, or I focus lock on it with a very small f-stop open aperture. But I'm zooming for this one quite a bit to kind of minimize all that space. So zoom and then position yourself closer to the objects or further away from the objects to minimize all that empty space in the background. That's where the vertigo effect comes in. So I think I'll use that one. All right, so all the work is in kind of thinking about your exposures. And though my exposures aren't very exciting because the limitations of the setting aren't very exciting, I do have some nice options here. And I think what I'll probably use are the two verticals and the horizontal. So these are my shots. And they all use focus in a pretty controlled way. So foreground in focus, background out of focus. Foreground out of focus, background in focus. And then foreground out of focus, middle ground in focus, background out of focus. And that's the one you're all required to have in some form, because that's the only way we can show 3 layers of distinct depth. Okay, now that I've got my exposures, it's time to just process them in the usual way. But this time I have a reason for processing them beyond just making them look good. I have a story in mind. I have a certain mood I'm trying to create. And I'm going to, just because I have a short time left in this demo, I like to keep them to 15 minutes. Instead of doing it all in Photoshop, sometimes I like to do a rough pass on processing before I get into Photoshop. It helps me work a little bit faster. So I'll just select those 3 exposures, and then I'll just double click to open them up in preview. And this is kind of my winning shot, so I'll start with that. And I just go to Tools, Adjust Color, and we haven't done this since the very beginning of class. But right here, now that we understand the histogram a little bit, what I like about this menu is, especially when I'm shooting in lighting conditions I can't control, like yellow fluorescence, I can immediately play with the color just by taking the temperature and kind of lining up the peaks in the histogram. This is a lot like matching your channel mixer to get a pure white. By lining up the 3 channels of green, blue, and red together, you're getting to a more realistic lighting. So that's what the classroom actually looks like, as opposed to what it was, which is kind of warmth added into everything from those fluorescents. And then you can decide, well, do I like what's naturalistic, or do I want to push it a little bit further? And I think for kind of a romantic story, I'm going to push it a little bit further towards the cools, especially since we have warm color paint on our walls. Right? And then I can always play with sharpening it a little bit. And that just increases the contrast in a really nice way around the sharpest edges. And then I can play with the tint in the other way. Do I want it tinted green? Definitely not. Maybe I want it tinted just a little bit magenta. Just a little bit. Just a smidge. Right? I'm not going to play with the levels here, but if I really needed to, I could. Just like we do in levels. But I like Photoshop better for that. But just for color temperature and sharpness, this is how I like to do a kind of a quick processing at the beginning. Okay, now on this one, same thing. Let's line up that histogram. And this, I kind of line up the peaks, and that's more the true color of it. About there. Take the sharpness, see if I want to push it just a little bit magenta, and I think I do. And that's the computer I'm working on right now. Eerie.